December 19, 1944, 10:30 p.m. In a freezing, snow-covered field near Bastogne, large canvas tents glow brightly against the winter dark. Massive Red Cross emblems are painted across the roofs and parked vehicles, internationally recognized symbols meant to guarantee sanctuary. Inside, exhausted surgeons of the 101st Airborne Division work by lantern light, desperately trying to stabilize wounded paratroopers. The silhouettes of doctors and stretchers are unmistakably clear through the illuminated canvas. Suddenly, the roar of heavy engines breaks the night. German armored vehicles emerge from the tree line and, without warning, unleash a relentless 15-minute machine gun barrage directly into the fragile hospital wards. Unarmed medics and helpless patients are trapped under deliberate, concentrated fire. When the guns finally stop, the shattered tents and bodies in the snow raise a horrifying question. What does the systematic destruction of a field hospital mean for the survival of the men defending Bastogne? This unprovoked assault did not just leave victims in the snow, it instantly annihilated the primary surgical lifeline for the entire 101st Airborne Division, exactly as the brutal siege of Bastogne was getting underway. Thousands of American paratroopers were about to be completely surrounded, and in a matter of 15 minutes, they had lost the surgeons, the specialized equipment, and the trained medics required to keep their wounded alive. Miles away, the news of the massacre reached General George S. Patton. He was already in the middle of a staggering logistical nightmare, attempting to pivot his entire Third Army 90 degrees in the freezing winter to smash through the German lines and relieve Bastogne. To Patton, the destruction of the medical camp was an immediate operational catastrophe that threatened to break the airborne's combat endurance, but it was also a profound moral violation, a deliberate war crime that demanded a raw, overwhelming response. Yet, Patton understood that in the chaotic, muddy churn of a winter offensive, atrocities are easily buried under the snow. If not secured immediately, the truth of what happened in the dark would fade into a nameless battlefield rumor. This presents a deeply compelling tension. How does one of the most ruthless, aggressive commanders of the Second World War balance the violent necessity of breaking a siege with the cold, methodical discipline required to document an atrocity before history forgets it? To answer that, and to understand how a fully equipped, clearly marked hospital was left so dangerously exposed to roaming German Panzers in the first place, we have to look back at the ground they chose to occupy just 12 hours earlier. Just 12 hours before the attack, the situation for the medics of the 101st Airborne Division seemed entirely under control. On the morning of December 19th, the 326th Airborne Medical Company arrived in the Belgian Ardennes after a grueling overnight transport from their garrison in Mourmelon, France. Hundreds of medics and surgeons had been packed into open-bed cargo trucks, driving without headlights through freezing sleet. By the time they reached the vicinity of Bastogne, the personnel were stiff with cold and operating on virtually no sleep. Yet, their immediate priority was the rapid establishment of a division-level clearing station to support the paratroopers deploying onto the chaotic front lines. The location chosen by the division command was a rural crossroads known as Barrière Hinck, situated near the municipality of Saint-Aude, approximately 8 miles west of Bastogne. In standard military doctrine, 8 miles is a calculated, reassuring distance. It places a vulnerable hospital well beyond the immediate lethal range of enemy tactical mortars and frontline artillery, while remaining close enough for motor ambulances to make rapid round trips from forward aid stations. When the medical staff began unloading their trucks, they did so with a distinct sense of security. They were establishing their position on the western side of Bastogne. Since the German offensive was punching through from the east, the entire combat strength of the 101st Airborne stood squarely between the hospital and the enemy. To the surgeons pounding tent pegs into the frozen soil, they were operating in the protected logistical rear, shielded by their own infantry. The deployment was a marvel of practiced efficiency. Within hours, the barren, snow-swept fields were transformed into a fully functioning surgical facility, capable of handling hundreds of casualties. Massive canvas tents were erected and lashed down against the biting wind. The internal layout was highly systematic: dedicated receiving tents for triage, preoperative wards, multiple surgical wings equipped with heavy wooden operating tables, and extensive recovery areas lined with folding cots. Because the ambient temperature was hovering near freezing, medics fired up gasoline generators and kerosene field stoves, attempting to bring the internal temperature up to a survivable level for men who had lost significant blood. Above all else, commanding officers ensured the hospital's non-combatant status was absolutely unmistakable. Huge white canvas panels, painted with brilliant red crosses, were staked flat across the snow to warn off aircraft. Similar massive emblems were painted onto the sloping roofs of the tents, and displayed on their ambulances. Under the rules of the Geneva Conventions, these symbols legally transformed the freezing compound into a sanctuary of protected neutrality. Almost as soon as the canvas walls were secured, the grim reality of the fighting to the east began funneling through their doors. The paratroopers had been thrown into desperate blocking actions in small villages north and east of Bastogne, engaging heavily armed German spearheads to buy time for the division to build a defensive perimeter. Ambulances soon began grinding their way down the icy roads, delivering a steady stream of casualties wounded by shrapnel and machine gun fire, many already suffering from the early stages of trench foot. Inside the illuminated tents, the atmosphere became a controlled, frantic blur of medical logistics. Unarmed surgeons moved methodically from one table to the next. Medical technicians scrambled to continuously sterilize steel instruments over portable stoves, while medics managed rapidly dwindling supplies of dried plasma, morphine, and sulfa powder. The physical environment inside the surgical wards was a stark contrast to the freezing reality outside. The air grew thick with the heavy scent of ether, sharp antiseptics, and the damp smell of wet wool uniforms drying near the kerosene heaters. Despite the crushing workload, there was a prevailing sense of institutional confidence. The medical staff of the 326th were elite, combat-tested personnel who had jumped into Normandy and Holland. They knew exactly how to manage mass casualties under extreme pressure. But in those previous campaigns, they had operated within established, well-defined perimeters. Here, in the Ardennes, their confidence was anchored to the assumption that the front line was a solid, impenetrable wall. This created a fatal disconnect between the assumptions of the rear echelon and the true reality of the battlefield. Inside the brightly lit tents, the doctors and nurses were focused entirely on saving the lives on the tables in front of them. The steady, reassuring thrum of their own electrical generators, combined with the predictable arrival of American ambulances, reinforced the illusion that their logistical lines were perfectly secure. They could hear the low rumble of heavy artillery miles away to the east, but that was merely the expected soundtrack of an active military sector. It sounded distant and contained. The medics operated with the unwavering belief that the airborne infantry was holding a tight perimeter, keeping the chaos of the German offensive far away. They had no way of knowing that the concept of a continuous front line in the Ardennes had completely disintegrated. The American command structure was struggling blindly to track a fluid battlefield where communication wires were constantly severed. Units were being bypassed and surrounded in the dense pine forests. Whole sectors of the map that appeared secure on headquarters acetate overlays were actually wide open. The medics at Barrière Hinck assumed they were shielded, unaware that the dense woods surrounding their position masked a sprawling wilderness where enemy mechanized columns were actively hunting for undefended roads. As the afternoon faded into a long, dark winter evening, the temperature plummeted further. The sky turned a bruised, heavy gray before giving way to pitch black. Inside the medical compound, the need for light became absolute. Surgeons could not operate on delicate vascular injuries in the dark. Powerful electric lamps and bright kerosene lanterns were turned up to their maximum output. Because the heavy canvas tents were not designed to be opaque, the entire medical compound transformed into a glowing beacon against the desolate, snow-covered landscape. From a distance, the brightly illuminated tents cast sharp, unmistakable silhouettes. Anyone watching from the dark could clearly see the shadows of doctors bending over operating tables, medics rushing between wards with supplies, and wounded men resting on cots. There was no attempt to camouflage the hospital, nor should there have been. Attempting to hide a medical unit would violate its protected status. The bright illumination and the massive red crosses were supposed to act as an invisible armor, projecting their non-combatant status into the night. The medical personnel went about their evening routines, bracing themselves for another agonizing night of incoming casualties. Doctors scrubbed their hands in freezing water for the next surgical rotation, while orderlies moved outside into the snow to unload the latest convoy of ambulances arriving from the Bastogne perimeter. It was approximately 10:30 p.m. The freezing air usually carried only the predictable sounds of the American side of the battlefield, the distant thump of outgoing mortars or the shifting gears of supply trucks. But as the medics stood outside the brightly lit triage tents, a completely different sound began to vibrate through the frozen ground. It wasn't the familiar whine of an American Jeep, nor the steady hum of Allied logistics. It was the heavy, rhythmic clanking of steel tank treads, accompanied by the deep, guttural roar of massive diesel engines. And most chilling of all, the sound was not coming from the embattled eastern front lines. It was echoing directly from the dense, snow-laden tree line to the west. from the deep rear, the exact direction where there was supposed to be nothing but safe territory. The massive shadows that broke through the western tree line were not American reinforcements. They were the armored half-tracks and heavy vehicles of a highly mobile reconnaissance group belonging to the German 116th Panzer Division. Tasked with finding a clear, paved route westward toward the Meuse River, this vanguard had slipped completely unnoticed through the shattered American lines. As they navigated the dark, frozen backroads, they had stumbled directly onto the glowing, illuminated footprint of the 326th Airborne Medical Company. The German column quickly fanned out, their vehicles encircling the snow-covered perimeter. The massive red crosses painted on the roofs and ambulances were glaringly visible in the ambient light. For a fleeting moment, the medics standing outside the triage tents assumed the armored vehicles would simply bypass the protected sanctuary. Instead, the night erupted in blinding flashes. Heavy machine gun fire ripped from the German turrets, tearing straight through the fragile canvas walls of the surgical wards. Because the tents were backlit by powerful electric lamps, every movement inside, the frantic surgeons, the medical technicians, the wounded lying helplessly on their cots, was projected as a crisp silhouette, giving the gunners perfect, unmistakable targets. The air instantly filled with the deafening roar of automatic weapons, the shattering of glass vials, and the chaotic shouts of unarmed men diving for the frozen earth. In the panicked scramble for survival, individual medics reacted with sheer instinct. Medical technician Thomas Aikman, caught in the open during the initial barrage, grabbed the handles of a loaded stretcher. With bullets snapping through the frigid air around him, Aikman desperately dragged the heavy canvas cot through the deep snow, straining to pull a wounded paratrooper to the safety of a shallow ditch. Only when he finally collapsed behind cover, gasping for breath, did he look down and realize the man he had just risked his life to save had already been killed in the crossfire. A few yards away, 19-year-old medic Henry Sullivan frantically tried to find cover near the vehicle park. He was positioned right beside an American ambulance, its sides painted with bold, unmistakable symbols of medical neutrality. It offered no protection. Sullivan was struck down beside the very vehicle designated to save lives, becoming one of the tragic casualties in an assault that blatantly ignored the established laws of war. After roughly 15 minutes of concentrated fire, the guns abruptly fell silent. Shouts in German pierced the cold air as infantrymen swarmed into the compound. The transition was terrifying and absolute. The medical staff were forced out of their shattered wards at gunpoint. Inside the tents, German soldiers began systematically dismantling the facility's capability to function. Vital surgical instruments were smashed, portable generators were wrecked, and whatever specialized medical supplies could not be looted were deliberately destroyed. In the freezing mud, roughly 130 American medical personnel, the primary surgeons, anesthesiologists, and highly trained orderlies of the 101st Airborne, were rounded up and stripped of their equipment. In a matter of minutes, the healers had been reduced to prisoners of war. The strategic implication was catastrophic. Just a few miles to the east, thousands of paratroopers were currently digging into the frozen ground around Bastogne, preparing to defend the town against overwhelming odds. Now, they were about to fight one of the most brutal sieges in American military history, entirely stripped of their surgical support. If a paratrooper took a severe wound, there was no longer anyone waiting in the rear to save him. As the German guards began aggressively organizing the captured Americans into columns for a forced march into captivity, the freezing chaos masked a desperate realization. One captive officer, looking at the burning ruins of their communications gear, understood a terrifying truth. If every single man was marched away into the darkness, the commanders trapped in Bastogne would never know what had happened to their hospital. If the defenders were going to survive, someone had to escape the encirclement and deliver a warning. Captain Jacob Pearl, a dental surgeon attached to the 326th Airborne Medical Company, understood that terrifying reality with absolute clarity. As the heavily armed German infantrymen poured into the shattered compound, screaming orders and forcing the bewildered American medical staff into tight columns, the frozen night dissolved into total chaos. The invaders were temporarily distracted by the sheer logistical burden of securing over 130 prisoners in the dark, while simultaneously looting the triage tents for desperately needed winter gear, morphine vials, and surgical kits. In the shifting, disorienting shadows cast by the headlights of idling Panzers and the flickering flames of burning American transport vehicles, Pearl made a quiet, definitive choice. He backed slowly away from the main cluster of captives, letting the deep darkness at the edge of the perimeter swallow his silhouette. Waiting for the exact moment when the guards turned their weapons toward a group of struggling stretcher-bearers, Pearl slipped past a wrecked, bullet-riddled ambulance, crawled beneath the torn canvas of a collapsed preoperative ward, and pushed his body headfirst into the dense, snow-laden pine trees bordering the Barrière Hinck crossroads. He was now entirely alone, operating deep behind an active, highly mechanized enemy spearhead. He possessed no winter combat gear, no weapon, and no compass to guide him. The ambient temperature was plummeting well below freezing, and the bitter wind cutting through the Ardennes forest carried a lethal, blinding chill. Pearl knew that he could not rely on the paved roads. Those arteries now belonged exclusively to the enemy, echoing with the heavy, metallic squeal of German tank treads and the deep rumble of troop transports pushing relentlessly westward. Instead, the dental surgeon was forced to navigate the punishing, unforgiving terrain of the forest interior. Waist-deep snowdrifts concealed frozen streams, jagged ravines, and tangled roots that threatened to break his ankles in the dark. His standard uniform quickly soaked through with melting snow, then froze solid against his skin, encasing him in a layer of ice. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, but the psychological burden he carried was far heavier. Pearl understood the terrifying mathematics of his situation. If he succumbed to hypothermia, fell into a ravine, or was executed by a roaming German patrol, he would die silently in the snow, and the commanders trapped inside the Bastogne perimeter would have absolutely no idea that their entire medical infrastructure had been wiped off the map. They would continue to fight, expecting motor ambulances that would never arrive, and sending critically wounded men backward to a hospital that no longer existed. Driven by this grim, unforgiving reality, Pearl navigated blindly by the dim, flickering flashes of distant artillery on the horizon. For agonizing hours, he moved like a ghost through the freezing wilderness. He was forced to freeze in place behind snow-covered logs as German mechanized patrols rumbled past in the darkness, listening to the alien, guttural shouts of enemy infantry communicating in the black pine woods. Finally, near the absolute edge of physical collapse, the faint shape of a sandbagged perimeter emerged through the falling snow. A sharp, tense voice suddenly cracked the silence, accompanied by the terrifying metallic click of a rifle bolt, an American sentry demanding the password. Pearl raised his freezing, trembling hands. He had successfully navigated through the German encirclement and reached a forward regimental aid station belonging to the 101st Airborne Division. Stumbling down into the dim, lantern-lit dugout, shivering violently and barely able to stand, the exhausted dental surgeon delivered the devastating intelligence. The 326th Medical Company was completely gone. The sanctuary was destroyed, the surgeons were captives. Bastogne was now entirely on its own. Inside the small, crowded regimental aid station, the initial reaction was sheer, paralyzing disbelief. The frontline medical officers, staring at the freezing surgeon, struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster he was describing. Barrière Hinck was supposed to be situated in the secure, protected logistical rear. The concept that a heavily armed German armored group had seamlessly bypassed the entire American front line, navigated the back roads, and annihilated a fully illuminated, clearly marked Red Cross facility was tactically unthinkable. But Captain Pearl's physical condition, half frozen, stripped of his equipment, and trembling with deep shock, was undeniable proof of the catastrophe. The local commanders realized immediately that this intelligence was far too critical to hold at the regimental level. It had to be transmitted up the chain of command instantly, before dawn broke and the battle resumed. But in the Ardennes forest, in December 1944, communication was a fragile, failing system. The heavy, relentless artillery barrages and the grinding steel treads of German Panzers had shredded miles of copper-field telephone wire laid across the snow. Radio signals bounced erratically off the dense, snow-covered hills and heavily forested valleys, severely limiting the range of the infantry's backpack radios. A communications officer furiously cranked the handle of a field telephone, desperately trying to find an intact, surviving line that routed back into the Bastogne perimeter. Against the odds, the signal punched through. When the desperate message finally broke through the static and reached the underground headquarters of the 101st Airborne Division, the atmosphere inside the command bunker shifted instantly. General Anthony McAuliffe and his senior staff were already managing a logistical nightmare. They were completely surrounded, heavily outnumbered, fighting in sub-zero temperatures and running dangerously low on artillery ammunition. Now, they were handed a dispatch confirming that they had absolutely zero surgical capacity remaining. The tactical implications were devastating and immediate. In a normal combat environment, an airborne soldier suffering from a severe shrapnel wound, internal bleeding, or a shattered femur had a strong chance of survival, provided he could reach a surgical table and receive a blood transfusion within the golden hour. Now, with the destruction of the 326th Medical Company, those exact same injuries were functional death sentences. Medics serving on the freezing front lines would have to strictly hoard their rapidly dwindling supplies of morphine, sulfa powder, and field bandages. They would be forced to watch helplessly as strong young men slowly died from shock, exposure, and blood loss in the snow, simply because there was no hospital left to receive them. The Bastogne perimeter was going to bleed out from within, long before they ran out of bullets. The transmission did not stop in the underground bunkers of Bastogne. The intelligence was far too significant to the wider war effort. It was rapidly encoded and pushed outward, crackling across long-range radio nets over the heads of the encircling German army. It jumped to the headquarters of the 8th Corps, where stunned staff officers analyzed the coordinates of the attack and mapped the terrifying depth of the German armored penetration. From there, the dispatch was encrypted into complex cipher machines, translating the human tragedy of the shattered hospital into blocks of scrambled text, and beamed hundreds of miles to the south, cutting through the severe winter storms hanging over France. The target destination was the city of Nancy, the heavily fortified nerve center of the United States Third Army. The encoded message was hunting for the one commander on the entire Western Front who possessed the armor, the unyielding authority, and the sheer operational momentum required to break the siege: General George S. Patton. At the exact moment the encrypted radio signals began arriving in Nancy, General Patton was deeply engaged in executing a maneuver that military war colleges around the world would later study as an absolute masterpiece of logistical violence. When the massive German Ardennes offensive originally broke through the American lines, creating a massive bulge in the front, the Allied High Command had been thrown into a state of tactical paralysis. Patton had stared at the rapidly expanding situation map, instantly recognized the catastrophic danger to the 101st Airborne, and boldly promised General Dwight D. Eisenhower that he could attack the German flank in just 48 hours. It was a promise that bordered on tactical insanity. The Third Army was heavily engaged in a brutal, grinding winter fight, pushing east toward the Saar River. Patton was now attempting to halt that massive offensive, safely disengage from a fighting enemy, pivot his entire army 90 degrees to the north, and launch a full-scale armored assault straight into the freezing Belgian mountains. He was actively moving 250,000 men. He was attempting to redirect tens of thousands of Sherman tanks, mechanized half-tracks, supply trucks, and heavy artillery pieces. The logistics behind this pivot were staggering, unprecedented, and seemingly impossible to achieve within the promised time frame. This was not a simple matter of drawing a new directional arrow on a map board. It required an agonizing, ground-level orchestration of heavy machinery, frozen terrain, and exhausted men. Military police units were forced to stand completely exposed at icy, mud-choked rural crossroads for 24 hours straight, desperately directing massive columns of armor through the blinding snow to prevent colossal traffic jams. Quartermaster supply officers had to rapidly relocate massive, sprawling dumps of high-octane aviation fuel, 155mm artillery shells, and winter combat rations, moving them over narrow, winding, two-lane country roads that were slick with dangerous black ice. Because the severe winter storms had completely grounded the Allied air forces, Patton had no aerial reconnaissance to guide his marching columns, and no fighter bombers to protect his tanks from ambushes. The endless convoys drove through the freezing nights, using only blackout drive lights, tiny horizontal slits of illumination that barely pierced the overwhelming darkness. Heavy supply trucks frequently slid off the icy, treacherous embankments, crashing heavily into deep ditches and constantly threatening to bottleneck the entire advance. The pressure resting on the Third Army command staff was suffocating. Every single hour lost on the iced roads meant another mile the German panzers advanced toward the Meuse River. Patton drove his subordinate commanders relentlessly, demanding violent speed above all other considerations. He stalked the wooden floors of his headquarters in Nancy, chewing unlit cigars, constantly recalculating complicated march tables and fuel consumption rates. He was orchestrating a massive symphony of friction, forcing a heavily armed bureaucracy to operate at a velocity it was never designed to achieve. It was directly in the middle of this high-stakes, pressure cooker environment, surrounded by the constant ringing of field telephones and frantic staff officers rapidly updating acetate map boards with grease pencils, that an intelligence officer stepped up to Patton's desk. In his hand was the freshly decoded dispatch originating from Captain Pearl's desperate escape. While the message reached the highest, most powerful echelons of the American military command, the German units responsible for the attack were simultaneously experiencing their own shifting reality in the snow. The armored vanguard that had decimated the hospital belonged to the elite 116th Panzer Division, commonly known as the Greyhound Division. Their primary operational objective was not the capture of Bastogne itself. Their strict orders were to bypass heavy resistance, locate intact paved roads, and drive relentlessly westward to secure the strategic bridges spanning the Meuse River. Speed was their only accepted metric of success. When their reconnaissance elements had broken through the tree line and discovered the glowing, illuminated footprint of the 326th Medical Company at Barrière Hinck, the local German commanders did not initially view the violent assault as a profound moral atrocity. Looking through the cold, ruthless lens of a desperate winter offensive, they saw it merely as a highly profitable tactical windfall. The German war machine operating in the Ardennes was critically starved for resources, especially gasoline and transport. By overrunning the hospital, they swiftly eliminated a key piece of enemy infrastructure operating in their path. They captured desperately needed American fuel, seized highly functional transport vehicles, and looted vital winter supplies. In their immediate view, taking 130 highly trained medical personnel prisoner was simply removing an operational asset that kept the American infantry fighting. It was a brutal, purely pragmatic calculation made in the dark, driven by the necessity of the advance. But as the morning sun finally rose over the frozen Ardennes, the psychological consequences of their actions began to manifest rapidly across the battlefield. The established laws of war, including the absolute protection of the Red Cross, exist not just out of high-minded morality, but to prevent combat from spiraling into absolute, uncontrollable savagery. When an army blatantly violates those rules, it fundamentally alters the nature of the enemy it faces. As frantic rumors of the hospital massacre spread quickly from foxhole to foxhole among the American paratroopers desperately defending the Bastogne perimeter, a grim, fatalistic hardening occurred across the line. The German advancing units began to notice a terrifying, distinct shift in the American resistance. Earlier in the war, heavily bypassed or entirely surrounded units might eventually recognize the absolute hopelessness of their tactical situation and surrender to save the lives of their remaining men. But the men of the 101st Airborne now knew with certainty that the enemy armor roaming freely in their rear had deliberately machine-gunned glowing medical tents and captured their doctors. Surrender was no longer viewed as a viable, survivable option. The American defensive positions in small, shattered villages like Noville, Foix, and Waldin transformed into suicidal standfasts. Paratroopers dug much deeper into the frozen, unyielding earth, fighting with a dark, bitter intensity, refusing to yield a single inch of ground, even when completely overrun. By violently destroying the medical sanctuary, the 116th Panzer Division had unintentionally eliminated the possibility of an honorable defeat for the Americans. They had kicked a hornet's nest, forging a trapped, desperate adversary that would now fight to the last bullet and the last man. The German field commanders began to slowly realize that leaving a trail of blatant atrocities behind them was not clearing a fast path to the Meuse. It was provoking a relentless, highly targeted fury that was about to crash directly into their flanks. Back in the dimly lit command post of the Third Army in Nancy, General Patton slowly took the decoded dispatch from his intelligence officer. Given Patton's deeply entrenched, highly publicized reputation, the seasoned staff officers standing in the room instantly braced for an explosion. This was the most volatile, aggressive combat commander in the United States military, a man widely known for his highly theatrical outbursts, his profanity-laced motivational speeches, and a volcanic temper that had famously stalled his own career in Sicily. A blatant, undeniable war crime, the slaughter of unarmed American medical personnel, operating clearly under the banner of the Red Cross, was exactly the kind of trigger that should have sent him into a blind, screaming rage. But the command tent remained completely, terrifyingly silent. Patton did not yell. He did not curse the enemy. He did not pound his fist on the heavy wooden planning table. He stood perfectly still, his pale eyes scanning the typewritten text. He read the dispatch once, silently absorbing the raw, horrifying facts of the assault. Then, in the heavy, expectant silence of the room, he deliberately read it a second time. He walked slowly over to the massive master map board that dominated the canvas wall. His eyes locked onto the small cluster of coordinates situated just west of Bastogne, locating the exact geographical position of the Barrière Hinck crossroads. His mind immediately went to work, calculating the grim, unforgiving mathematics of the battlefield. Patton understood exactly what this dispatch meant for the men currently freezing in foxholes. Without the 326th Medical Company, the combat endurance of the surrounded Airborne Division was fundamentally broken. Every single American casualty inside that rapidly shrinking perimeter was now functionally permanent. The men bleeding in the snow had nowhere to go. If the Third Army did not break through the thick German lines faster than originally planned, they would not be rescuing a defiant Airborne Division. They would simply be recovering a frozen graveyard. Patton turned away from the map board, his face an unreadable mask of intense, focused calculation. He demanded that his intelligence staff immediately identify the exact German unit operating in that specific sector of the forest. He wanted the division designation, the armor movement vectors, and the identities of the commanding officers of the armored group that had fired on the hospital. The staff officers moved frantically, cross-referencing captured enemy documents and recent radio intercepts, quickly confirming the presence of the 116th Panzer Division in the attack zone. The psychological pressure inside the headquarters hit an absolute maximum. The senior colonels and majors watched their commanding general, fully expecting the inevitable. An aggressive combat commander facing a deliberate massacre normally answers with raw, unchained violence. The staff anticipated a direct, furious order for a retaliatory saturation bombardment, a command to unleash the heavy artillery and completely obliterate every grid square in the German path, or a ruthless, off-the-record directive to the advancing armored columns to take absolutely no prisoners in that sector. They waited for the order to burn the enemy out of the snow. Patton did issue an immediate operational command. He turned to his logistics officers and mandated a critical, immediate adjustment to the complex march tables. He ordered that the moment the armored spearheads of the Third Army punched a hole through the German lines, heavily loaded medical transport trucks, fresh surgical teams, and mobile field hospitals were to be positioned directly behind the lead Sherman tanks. They were ordered to drive straight into Bastogne the very second a corridor was cracked open, regardless of ongoing enemy fire or unsecured flanks. The medical pipeline had to be re-established before the town bled to death, overriding all other supply priorities. But it was the next order that caught the entire command staff completely off guard. Patton paused, looking back down at the dispatch detailing the shattered tents, the bullet-ridden ambulances, and the captured doctors. He understood the chaotic, muddy churn of a massive winter war. He knew that in the violent momentum of a massive counteroffensive, atrocities are incredibly easy to bury under the snow, rapidly dismissed as battlefield rumors, or permanently lost in the dense fog of combat. He knew that raw vengeance would not bring the dead surgeons back, nor would it hold the guilty accountable in the eyes of history. And so, instead of ordering a blind artillery strike or a mandate of retribution, the most aggressive general in the American Army issued a secondary directive that was chillingly methodical, an order that profoundly shifted the military response from a temporary act of battlefield vengeance to a permanent act of undeniable justice. Patton's operational answer to the obliteration of the 326th Medical Company was characterized by a distinct lack of dramatic theater, yet it possessed a terrifying logistical violence. He ruthlessly accelerated the already unprecedented movement of the Third Army. Under severe winter storms that kept Allied aircraft grounded, massive columns of Sherman tanks, armored half-tracks, and supply trucks were forced to navigate narrow, ice-covered Belgian roads using only blackout drive lights. Quartermaster officers were driven to the brink of collapse, rapidly relocating massive dumps of fuel and artillery ammunition to keep up with the shifting armored spearheads. Patton commanded that fresh surgical teams and mobile field hospitals be positioned directly behind the lead combat elements, mandated to drive into Bastogne the very moment a rescue corridor was opened. But while he single-mindedly pushed his 250,000 men forward at a velocity that bordered on mechanical insanity, Patton refused to let the brutality at the Barrière Hinck crossroads become just another nameless statistic lost in the dense fog of war. He recognized that raw military vengeance would not save the paratroopers currently bleeding to death, nor would a blind artillery barrage hold the specific perpetrators accountable in the eyes of history. And so, amid the high-pressure chaos of orchestration, he issued a secondary directive that was deeply methodical and disciplined, an order that fundamentally shifted the military response from temporary battlefield anger to a permanent demand for undeniable justice. Patton mandated an immediate formal investigation into the assault on the protected medical compound, deliberately freezing a moment of forensic clarity within the fluid, screaming chaos of an active counteroffensive. Intelligence officers from the 3rd Army headquarters were dispatched directly behind the advance, strictly ordered to lock down the proof while the snow around the Barrière Hinck crossroads remained undisturbed and the survivors were still reeling from the shock. These forensic investigators were commanded to locate and record detailed, sworn testimonies from witnesses, like the sentries at the regimental aid station and Captain Jacob Pearl, cataloging every specific detail of the 15-minute machine gun barrage. A separate forensic team was ordered to move only as fast as they could carefully photograph the scene, capturing undeniable visual evidence of the heavy machine gun bullet holes ripping through massive Red Cross emblems painted onto the canvas tent walls. Every item of destroyed equipment, the smashed portable generators, the sterile instrument kits ground into the frozen mud, and the burned-out hulks of clearly marked motor ambulances, was to be formally catalogued as a tactical violation of the Geneva Conventions. The most vital part of Patton's order was to create a meticulous, legally sound record of the identity of every single victim, doctors, surgeons, anesthesiologists, and helpless patients, and to irrevocably connect those deaths to the specific armored units of the 116th Panzer Division that had carried out the systematic assault. This strategic approach created a suffocating tension inside the 3rd Army's moving headquarters, placing the obsessive, slow discipline required to build a prosecution in absolute friction with the overwhelming operational necessity to advance the armored relief columns toward the surrounded garrison. To break through the German lines, Patton required every single hour, every available fuel truck, and the total operational focus of his staff. Yet, he was deliberately spending precious logistical equity to ensure that this atrocity was formally documented before the reality of the German defeat allowed the truth of the crime to simply dissolve into the Belgian snow. While the intelligence teams knelt in the freezing mud of Barrière Hinck, meticulously photographing bullet holes in canvas, and cataloging the frozen, looted remnants of the 326th Medical Company, the sheer mechanical violence of Patton's offensive finally struck Bastogne. On the afternoon of December 26th, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division, the tip of the 3rd Army's spear, battered their way through the German lines from the south. They managed to fracture the siege, but they did not shatter it completely. The breakthrough created a fragile, incredibly dangerous corridor barely a few hundred yards wide. This single lifeline was surrounded by dense woods still swarming with German infantry, and the narrow paved road was entirely zeroed in by enemy artillery. Geysers of frozen earth and shrapnel erupted continuously along the route. In any standard military operation, a contested bottleneck like this dictates a strict logistical sequence. You push heavy armor through first to widen the gap, followed by infantry to secure the flanks, and finally, cargo trucks hauling 155mm shells to feed the guns. But standard doctrine had been overridden days earlier by the commanding general in Nancy. Patton's explicit mandate regarding the medical crisis was absolute. He knew that inside the shattered town of Bastogne, hundreds of severely wounded paratroopers were lying on concrete cellar floors, slowly dying from shock and infection because the German vanguard had captured all their surgeons a week prior. Following Patton's strict march tables, the military police directing traffic at the edge of the corridor halted a massive column of waiting Sherman tanks. Instead, they frantically waved forward a specialized convoy of soft-skinned transport trucks. These vehicles offered absolutely no armor protection. They were driven by quartermasters and filled not with bullets, but with replacement surgeons, field medics, thousands of units of dried plasma, morphine syrettes, and sterile surgical bandages. It was an astonishing gamble, sending completely vulnerable unarmored medical units straight into an active artillery funnel before the road was even tactically secure. The drivers dropped their gears and accelerated blindly into the corridor. Mortar shells slammed into the frozen fields on either side of them, throwing shards of ice and dirt against the windshields, but the medical trucks did not stop. They raced past burning half-tracks and infantrymen still locked in active firefights, navigating the smoking, cratered road through sheer velocity. When these unarmored trucks finally tore into the shattered streets of Bastogne, they did not wait for the fighting to subside. Surgeons jumped from the tailgates before the vehicles had fully parked, hauling heavy wooden crates of medical supplies directly down into the freezing basements of ruined churches and civilian homes. Within minutes of their arrival, the catastrophic vacuum created by the massacre at Saint-Oud was filled. Operating by the dim light of flashlights and kerosene lanterns, these fresh medical teams immediately began administering blood transfusions and performing life-saving surgeries on men who had been waiting in agony for days. The rapid insertion of this medical pipeline instantly saved hundreds of airborne soldiers who would have otherwise bled out in the cold. The tactical crisis was resolved. Patton's violent, high-speed logistical gamble had successfully reversed the devastating operational impact of the German attack. The physical rescue of Bastogne was secured. But as the American armor continued to pour through the widened corridor, grinding the German offensive to a halt, the fate of the war crime committed at the Barrière Hinck crossroads remained suspended. Defeating the enemy in the snow was only half the equation. Preserving the memory of what they had done in the dark required an entirely different kind of endurance. The shattered canvas tents were eventually cleared away, the frozen craters were filled in, and the quiet Belgian fields returned to their desolate stillness. The bright, glowing silhouette of a medical sanctuary under fire, the horrifying image that had initiated the crisis, was gone. Without General Patton's secondary orders, the reality of what happened to those illuminated triage wards would have vanished right along with the winter ice. In the aftermath of any massive conflict, time acts as a relentless adversary to the truth. The chaotic momentum of war has a natural tendency to bury its darkest moments. Without immediate, deliberate forensic intervention, atrocities committed in the dead of night inevitably degrade into vague rumors. Over the decades, they become disputed footnotes, deflected by the defeated as exaggerated propaganda, or simply forgotten entirely in the shadow of larger strategic victories. An armored division can obliterate an opposing army on the battlefield, but high-explosive artillery shells cannot preserve a historical fact. Patton understood this fragile distinction perfectly. His dual approach to the catastrophe recognized that military retaliation was only half the solution. By forcing his intelligence teams to operate with the same relentless urgency as his combat brigades, he anchored a fleeting moment of savagery to an unshakable, documented record. Because forensic investigators meticulously locked down the sworn witness accounts from survivors, because they photographed the heavy machine gun tears ripping through the massive Red Cross emblems, and because they irrevocably tied the assault to the specific armored vanguard of the 116th Panzer Division, the destruction of the 326th Airborne Medical Company could never be denied. It was permanently transformed from a nameless battlefield legend into an established, irrefutable historical reality. The shattered ambulances and the captured surgeons were not left to the mercy of fading memories or revisionist debates. The institutional discipline required to collect those critical forensic details in the middle of a screaming, sub-zero offensive proved just as vital as the tanks that finally broke the siege. It demonstrated a profound reality of human conflict. While overwhelming military force can halt an enemy's advance, only objective, meticulously preserved evidence can defend the truth against the relentless passage of time. The snow that covered the Barrière Hinck crossroads that winter would inevitably melt, washing away the physical scars of the shattered surgical tents and the burned-out ambulances. Patton knew that the terrifying impermanence of the battlefield meant the medics who fell in the dark could easily become forgotten casualties of a much larger campaign. He wielded his armored columns to shatter the siege of Bastogne and pull the airborne infantry back from the brink of annihilation, answering the tactical disaster with overwhelming mechanical force. But he left behind a different kind of legacy in the freezing mud of Saint-Oud. In the brutal calculus of war, the cold steel of an advancing army can reclaim lost ground, and armor can avenge the dead, but only ink, photographs, and meticulous evidence can ensure their murder is never erased from history.